Okay, welcome back to our series on using Melco Design Shop. And today we're going to talk about how to manually draw certain stitches that you might need to use to either make a design from scratch or modify an existing design that didn't convert 100% correctly. Odds are you'll have to use some of these at some point when converting a design because the conversion process isn't perfect, though sometimes it can be perfect and you won't need to use any of these tools, but they're always good to know. So we're going to start with our first stitch type here, which is called a walk stitch. And a walk stitch, right now I'm just left clicking on my mouse in a few different places, drawing these lines. Then I'm going to hit enter. All it does is create a stitch that looks like that. So if I zoom in on this, zoom in, this is not great, but if I zoom in, you can see each of these little stitches here. If I click on my object and I want to change the stitch length, I can do that. So if I shorten the stitch length, it'll add more stitches, increase the stitch length, it'll decrease the number of stitches. But all those dots that I was clicking my left mouse to create, these triangles, are just the path that this is going to follow. If I wanted to do instead a curved line, I would first need to left click to define a straight point, and then I can use my mouse to right click and define little points along a curve, something like this. Hit enter, and now I've defined a curved walk stitch. For the most part, you're probably not going to be using walk stitches just because, they're a single stitch thick, and that's usually not great for embroidery. You're not going to be able to see it very well. Most of the time, we'll use things like single line center, column stitches, and fill stitches. Next, let's talk about that single line center. So single line center, if I click on that tool and then I left click on one area and left click on another and click enter twice, it's going to draw a stitch up along that line, with that line being the center. That's why it's called single line center. Now, the stitches drawn in single line center by default are called a satin stitch. A satin stitch is this kind, you can kind of see it here. It's this wavy back and forth, left, right. These stitches are really good for lettering. They make letters really pop out off the fabric. But they're also really good for most things that are less than 50 points in width. I can check how wide something is by clicking on my ruler here, and then just dragging a line across. And I can see this is 22 points in length. If I could theoretically do something up to 50 points in length, and you could do things greater than 50 points in length, but generally if you're doing something greater than 50 points in length, it's usually best for the look of the fabric that you use a fill stitch. But if for uniformity, if you have like a bunch of larger letters and a bunch of smaller letters, and those small letters are going to be satin stitches, you can use satin stitches on the larger letters as well. It's just a higher risk that your fabric might have errors in it, but you can always try it. So that was a single line center. Like with the other one, you can make curves. So if I left click first to create a straight point, and then right click to create these curved points represented by circles, and then when I'm done, hit enter twice, I'm going to have a now satin stitch along that curve, and it's single line center. So that is the single line center tool. It's very useful for creating outlines. Next is the column tool. So there's two types of column tools, and they just vary in how you draw the column. So there's the column one input method, which I'll show you now. And then if you hold on the left click on your mouse, you can see the other option is column two, but we're going to do that a bit later. So let's start with column one tool. Here is where stitch direction starts to become important. Usually when you have a column stitch, it sometimes can be a satin stitch, but it often can be a fill stitch. Both of them have specific stitch directions. Usually with a satin stitch, it's going to stay horizontal so that the stitch is parallel to whatever lines you draw. But a fill stitch, you often want to have your stitches on an angle. That helps the stitches be more ingrained into the fabric. You generally don't want your stitches when you're doing a fill stitch to be purely vertical with the grain of the fabric and purely horizontal against the grain of the fabric, because each of those is going to cause their own issues. You generally want to go at a slight angle. It also looks more aesthetic. So What's important about this is when I'm drawing this column 1, the first line that I draw is going to represent the stitch direction. Now, I can always change it later, but just for ease of use, this is going to make your life a lot easier when you're drawing these, is know your stitch direction when you draw the column. So let's say I want my stitch direction to be horizontal. So the first line I draw is going to need to be horizontal. Then I click here. The next line I draw is just going to extend the length of my column. If I want to constrain this to make this line perfectly straight, I can hold the Alt key and it's going to make it straight along whatever angles I want. So let's say I want a straight line here and I'm holding Alt. And then this is how the column tool works. I'm constraining this line to be straight, and then it's going to create this enclosed shape. I'm going to hit Enter, and now I've got this satin stitch in the direction that I wanted it to be. I'm going to hit Escape to exit this tool and go to my Select tool. You can see you have your entry point and your exit point already defined. Now, if I don't want to do that. If I pull my entry point up here and my exit point down here, this doesn't mean that you're entering somewhere over here and exiting somewhere over here. That wouldn't really make a lot of sense because then you'd have a stitch in the way. What this really means is it's going to enter at the top left corner of this shape and the bottom right corner of the shape. So whether it's right here or right here, it's going to perform the same function. Now, notice what would happen if I move my entry point down here. There's going to be a slight difference in the fabric here. And if I move my exit point up here, there's also a slight difference. You can play around with these just to see exactly what you like, but generally on opposite diagonal ends is good. You also want to consider that your entry point should usually be on the innermost towards the center of your design, and your exit point should be towards the edge of your design. That ensures that when we're embroidering, since we're entering up here, we're embroidering from top to bottom, and that's going to stretch the fabric downwards. So generally, when we're embroidering something from the center outwards, we're stretching the fabric outwards from the center. If we did it the other way and embroidered from the outside in, we would end up with some puckering on the fabric, and that's just not going to look very good. So we've got the satin stitch here. If I wanted to change it over to a fill stitch, I can click on stitch type up here and click fill. And now it changes to a fill stitch. Notice that you can see the stitch grain direction is still horizontal. So let's say I wanted to change that stitch direction. Maybe I didn't define it correctly when I drew my column. I'm going to click on this insert stitch direction tool after I've clicked on my object. And I don't see any stitch direction currently inserted. So I'm going to click on one line here, and I can see I've got the stitch direction inserted. Now, if I move this, you can see my stitch direction changes. Now, something to be mindful of with your stitch direction is you can see the stitches are much more dense up here and less dense down here. So you have to be wary of that. But generally speaking, if you're doing just a fill stitch and you have one stitch direction, it's going to look fine. Let's talk about column 2. So column 2, you're probably going to use this a lot less, but this one is helpful for when you're making columns that do not have parallel lines. So what we're talking about is, let's say I was trying to draw the letter C. I could do that very easily with a single line center. That makes it pretty easy. But let's say I wanted to do it with a column instead. So I would first click here and make a straight point with that triangle. And then I can start right clicking to make curved points to draw this letter C. Now, once I'm done with the first edge, I need to click Enter. And that's going to bring me to the other edge. That's just how this column tool works. Otherwise, it's not going to create your shape. So once you've defined a certain number of points that define one edge, click Enter. And now I'm going to define a straight point here and then some curves around here to make a really not great looking letter C, but you get the point. And once I've come around almost to the end, I can click Enter and it's just going to complete itself. And now you can see we've got this column stitch, just like the other one was before. You can see that it's a satin stitch. If I wanted to make it a fill stitch, I could change it to a fill stitch. It looks pretty much the same. And these are going to be pretty similar to each other. The next thing is underlay. You probably won't have to worry about this too much, but let's say this was a satin stitch. You can see that the underlay is a fill stitch. If you take this little progress bar down here and drag it, you can actually see how it's going to sew. So the little pattern on this underlay layer that it does before it starts going left and right is in the pattern of a fill stitch. It's kind of like 3D printing where you go left and right and then cross over yourself again. That's a fill stitch pattern. That's what each of these fills on the top mean. So if I were to change this, for instance, to none, this is like the left side underlay and the right side underlay. The left side underlay disappears, so I'm just doing this right side underlay. And then if I change this to none, there's just completely no underlay at all. And you generally don't want that. So you probably won't ever have to change this, but like, let's say you needed more support on your drawing or something, you could change to a zigzag. You could change your underlays. I'm not super familiar with exactly which ones you would want to do in which case scenarios. Usually I just leave it as fill. Okay, so we've talked about underlay. We've talked about the different columns. Now we're going to talk about the complex fill. So complex fill is probably the most common tool that you're going to end up using. If you're not doing something that's strictly a column and you're doing something that's more of an abstract shape, you're going to want to use complex fill. And this is generally when you're talking about using fill stitches. So let's say I wanted to do a very large circle. What I could do is select this complex fill tool, left click to get my triangle point, which I always need to have first. And then I can start right clicking to get a circle shape. And once I'm almost done, I can click enter and it'll complete the shape. Now, you'll notice that it actually hasn't filled itself in. That's because the next step in this process is to input a hole. Now, it's kind of like a three-step process. It'll ask you to draw the shape. It'll ask you to input any holes if you want to input a hole, and then it'll actually create the shape. Let's say I don't want any holes in this drawing, so I'm going to hit enter again. And now it's going to ask me to define my stitch direction. So I'm going to drag from here to here, define my stitch direction, and here we go. We've got a fill stitch with that stitch direction that we defined with no holes. If I click escape and just go to my select tool, I can see where my entry and exit points have arbitrarily been defined. I might want to move this one over here and this one over here, just so it's kind of like drawing a line that's perpendicular to where my stitch direction is. If I wanted to change my stitch direction, I could go back to this insert stitch direction tool and just drag this line, and that changes my stitch direction here. No big deal. If I wanted to draw a hole after the fact, I can click this insert hole button. Let's say I just wanted some rectangular hole like this. Click enter, it draws a hole. Similarly, if I wanted to make another complex fill and draw a hole in my complex fill while I'm drawing it, I would click enter to complete the shape. And now it's asking me if I want to input a hole. So now I would draw that hole, click enter, it inputs the hole. I don't want to enter any more holes, so I hit enter. And now I want my stitch direction to be like this. And you've just defined a complex fill. Some things that might be important with this fill and all the other types of stitches as well as your stitch density. You can bump up the stitch density and it's going to bring your stitches closer together. And if you bump down this, or actually, I'm sorry, if you bump up the stitch density somewhat counterintuitively, it brings the stitches further apart. But if you lower that stitch density, it's going to bring all the stitches much closer together. So if you are embroidering something and you find there's some gaps between your letters or something like that, you might want to drop that stitch density. You can also manually change the stitch angle here without changing much else. And this pull offset, you probably don't have to worry too much about that, but you can play with some of these settings if you'd like. So that is the basics of all of our different types of basic stitches. What I'm also going to show you is how to do lettering. So you can always draw on letters in this software. So let's say you want to import a JPEG and draw on letters using a column stitch or something like that. You can do that manually. That works. It's fine. But we always recommend that if you have any text in your design, that you just make the lettering in this software by typing it out. So I've clicked on my letter tool. I'm going to type my letters. Hello. It's really large, so I'm going to zoom out. And now it's created automatically satin stitches for these letters. I can go up here and change the font to anything I want. So for instance, I want this font, or they have some 2-color fonts as well. And I can change my letter height. I can change whether I want this to be in an arc, and I can change my arc length. I can make the letters vertical, or I can just do it like this. And as you can see, these are satin stitches. I could change it to be a fill stitch, and it would change the look of it. But generally with lettering, as long as it's not too large, you want it to be a satin stitch because it looks a lot better. It pops out of the fabric. And then I can also go and change the inner color of this by selecting all of the inner color pieces here. And let's say I want to change that to green. Now my inner color is green. And if I wanted to change the outer color, I would change all these pumpkin spice colors to a different color. Okay, and that is generally how to do your basic stitches and how to do text. We'll see you at the next video.